Magda is an interesting commander because all three aspects of her rules text are extremely relevant and synergistic. Other dwarves you control get +1/+0. Whenever a dwarf you control becomes tapped, create a treasure token, and then sacrifice 5 treasures, search your library for an artifact or a dragon card, put that card onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. Because we want to use Magda's ability to search our library for things, we need to generate the treasures to do so. Swinging with her a Universal Automaton, which is a 1/1, is just asking to lose our creature in most situations. So having it be a 2/1 instead of a 1/1 with Magda's first ability makes it so that some of the creatures in the format that might be used as a blocker early don't necessarily want to trade with your generic 1/1. In addition to this, because you're getting +1/+0, it gives you access to Crew 2. So instead of having to attack in, you can now just crew a vehicle instead. So because our main game plan is looking to generate these treasures to use Magda's ability, what are we using the ability for? The first thing that we can use it for are combo pieces, such as Clock of Omens, Battered Golem, Maskwood Nexus, Roaming Throne, the vehicles that we use to tap, among other things. We can also use them on Stax pieces, or things that can slow the game down. Some decks are on more than others, and a majority of the decks are at least on things like Grafdigger's Cage, Tanglewire, God Pharaoh Statue, and Torpor Orb, while others are also on things like Nullrod, Damping Sphere, other spheres. There are some decks that run things like Blood Moon or Magus of the Moon, and these are not necessarily tutorable by Magda, but they are very strong in the meta. Magda's tutor ability is special, because similar to some other things that don't require a target until resolution, Magda's tutor functions the same way. So if your opponent is looking to figure out what you're going to grab, they don't get the opportunity until it resolves, and at that point it's too late. This is an interaction that's very important for things like Spine of Isha, which lets you get rid of a target permanent, or Portal to Phyrexia, which will force sacrifice of 3 creatures of your opponents. So the earlier in the game that Portal to Phyrexia is used, the better. This also means that if your opponent reacts to you putting this on the stack with a removal spell, so that you can't go and combo off with something like Clock of Omens, you can then pivot what you're going to get into a silver bullet piece like a Damping Sphere to shut down the Rog's Eye, a God Pharaoh statue to make it harder for everyone, or you can go and grab that Portal of Phyrexia while your opponent has a Dockside on field. The Dockside will go to their bin, and then you can go and grab it the next turn. Then, if Magda is inside of your own graveyard, you can get her back the following turn and just win in many cases. But those sort of magical Christmas land things aren't very common. So in most situations, you're just going to be doing things for value. But being able to not have to declare what you're getting until the resolution makes it amazing in the fact that your opponents don't really get to know what you're getting unless you choose to share that information. This video is broken down into multiple sections. The first section consists of ways to make infinite treasures, which I call combo starters, such as an Artifact Dwarf and Clock of Omens, Battered Golem, Maskwood Nexus, and a tap outlet, or Goblin Welder, Maskwood Nexus, and other pieces such as Erech's Tempting Apple. The next couple sections talk about making infinite treasures through Stax pieces, and the Stax pieces that you can combo through are usually going to be here, or they're going to specifically be named in the slide for the combo itself. Then we talk about making treasures without actually being a combo line, more of like value treasures like copying Dockside, and then we transition into ending the game or combo enders, such as Elixir of Immortality in combination with Erech's Tempting Apple after you've made infinite untapped treasures. Now, in most cases, we're going to be showing things in the middle here that we're going to be tutoring for or that are important. But in other cases, these things might be in the right-hand side like this, as not all the clips were done on the same day. If something is stopping you from winning, it will normally be on the bottom right side, or it will be in the slide for each combo ender, to show that it doesn't win or it does win through specific things, or if it requires a specific board state or something on the board, it will also show you that with an asterisk. The Clock of Omens combo is one of our most important and basic combos in the deck. It allows you to use Clock of Omens and any creature that is a artifact that is also considered a dwarf. So this is anything that is a changeling, such as Universal Automaton or Bloodline Pretender, as well as things like Adaptive Automaton and Roaming Throne that will allow you to ETB them and choose dwarf as the creature type. So the basic way that the combo works is that you use Clock of Omens' ability, tap 2 untapped artifacts you control to untap target artifact. So you'll tap Universal Automaton, which is an artifact dwarf, Clock of Omens, targeting Universal Automaton. This will put a Magda trigger on the stack to generate a treasure. The treasure will then ETB, which will then allow you to resolve the untap of Universal Automaton. Once this happens, you'll then use your artifact dwarf and the treasure that you just generated in order to do the same thing, targeting your artifact dwarf, untapping it, generating another treasure. In this case, it would be untapped. So you'll continue this process until you make infinite tapped treasures. And then you go from there into a way to make untapped treasures, which I will cover after this. Now, there are other ways that this situation can function. Now, one of the most important ones is Maskwood Nexus combined with any vehicle. When you crew the vehicle with Magda, it becomes a creature. With Maskwood Nexus, this enables your vehicle to actually become a dwarf, or it is a dwarf because of Maskwood Nexus. So that then you can use Clown Car or any artifact with Clock of Omens to loop the same way that you would with any other artifact dwarf creature. Another way that you can actually do this is by using Liquimetal Torque targeting any dwarf. So in this case, we can target Magda, and then we can start the loop with Magda plus Clock of Omens. So you'll tap Clock of Omens and Magda, since she's an artifact, targeting Magda, untapping her, and making a treasure. The last way is Mirror of the Forebears, which when it ETBs, you can name dwarf, and then you can pay 1 to have it transform into Magda. Our Magda on the board will legend rule off the field. This will be an artifact, so then you can use Clock of Omens and the Mirror of the Forebears version of Magda in order to loop the combo. Now, once you have infinite tapped treasures, an untapped treasure, and your artifact dwarf, you can then go get either Roaming Throne or a combination of Maskwood Nexus and Zorn in order to both get the exact same effect, where when you start your combo up again, instead of Magda generating 1 treasure, you will get double the triggers, either through double triggering from Roaming Throne or the replacement effect from Zorn, giving you 2 treasures instead of 1. Battered Golem is a backup win condition if your Clock of Omens is removed, or if your board state just allows for it to happen. So Battered Golem reads, whenever an artifact comes into play, you may untap Battered Golem. He does have the downside where he doesn't untap during your untap step, but that doesn't really matter. Now, as long as Maskwood Nexus is in play, Battered Golem is a dwarf. So as long as you have a way to tap him, such as a vehicle or Dwarven Blood Boiler, when you tap him to these, it'll generate a treasure token, which will ETB, putting the Battered Golem untap on the stack, resolve the untap, and then you do it again. You crew or you tap to Dwarven Blood Boiler, making infinite untapped treasures, and then you can win the game however you want. decks that can afford to attribute slots to stopping Dockside or just treasures or artifact usage in general is very powerful. So having things like Blind Obedience, Dauntless Dismantler, Manglehorn, and Root Maze as ways to slow down the decks that are trying to leverage Dockside to win the game is very powerful. And specifically with Dauntless Dismantler, being able to pay only 1 white and sacrifice it to destroy all artifacts, on top of the fact that your opponent's artifacts enter the battlefield tapped, is absolutely ridiculous. So, because Clock of Omens combo requires your artifacts to ETB untapped, you can't actually do it. So this means that you have to use a Battered Golem combo using Maskwood Nexus. So since we don't have access to our Clock of Omens combo, we need to actually find a way to make infinite untapped treasures. And while you can shortcut this by making infinite tap treasures, tapping Battered Golem to crew your clown car or use Dwarven Bloodboiler's ability to make infinite tap treasures, and then going and grabbing Spine of Isha to remove the Root Maze or the Blind Obedience or any of the creatures, one of the problems then becomes Dauntless Dismantler has 4 defense. So bolting this is not going to be a viable option. You'll need to do something like Dead and Gone using the Gone side, or you will need to do something else to get rid of it. But luckily, there is a line to not necessarily need to get rid of any of these. So there are decks that don't run Spine, and this is one of the ways that you can get around it with that. So assuming this is your board state, you will go and grab Clock of Omens, and then you will also go and grab either Sculpting Steel or Cursed Mirror. So I'm just going to grab Cursed Mirror in this example. This is going to ETB as a copy of Battered Golem, which will ETB tapped. You'll tap Battered Golem to crew or use Bloodboiler to untap both of these. At this point, you will use Clock of Omens ability to tap both Battered Golems, targeting a treasure. You'll untap the treasure, the triggers for Magda will go off, untapping these, and at this point you can just continue to tap both of these for Clock of Omens ability to untap a tapped treasure, which will untap both of these, repeat the process, and then you can win however you want from having infinite untapped treasures. This is a combo that Rust has made a video about, using Goblin Welder in combination with Maskwood Nexus to make Welder a dwarf. Once this is a dwarf, its ability when used will also cause a treasure to be generated. So if you play Welder and then you play Erech's Tempting Apple to give it haste, you can do this line if you have 5 treasures, or if Welder and Apple are both on field. Otherwise, you'll need 10 treasures to get both Apple and Sculpting Steel. So for this particular example, we're going to start with 5. This combo is relatively complicated for 2 reasons. One of them is that you can just trade Erech's Tempting Apple with Sculpting Steel if you have Judge's approval based on understanding of the rules. The Welder's ability can't fully resolve because it's a simultaneous ability until the actual replacement effect of Sculpting Steel has declared what it's going to be, which Apple at that time will technically be on the field, as Sculpting Steel and Apple can never be in the same place as once. So it makes for some weird rulings. That being said, there is a way that you can do this without having any judge need to read between the lines or get any opinion on if the interaction can work. And that's going to be the one that we're going to look at. So from this particular point, we're going to assume that either Welder and Apple have both been played this turn, or that Welder is on the field. You've already used 5 treasures to go get Apple. Now, when this occurs, 5 treasures are still going to be available. So we're going to go and get Sculpting Steel for these 5 treasures. This is going to ETB as a copy of Apple, legend rule, put it to the bin. So from this point, we're going to tap Welder, targeting Sculpting, Steel, and Apple. Magda trigger is going to occur, and we're going to generate a treasure. These are going to swap. Apple ETB, untap Welder. And then from this point, we tap Welder, targeting Sculpting, Steel, and a treasure, but the Magda trigger will happen first, generating a treasure. Treasure will go to the bin. Sculpting Steel will ETB as a copy of Apple, legend rule, ETB trigger, untap Welder. You'll then Sculpting Steel for Apple, generating a treasure. Sculpting Steel will go to the bin. Apple will come to field, untapping Welder. And then you will trade the Sculpting Steel for a treasure, but in the process make another treasure. So you're going to continue this loop over and over and over again until you have infinite untapped treasures, because every other loop is going to generate a net positive treasure. So the loop will end by you having Apple on field with an untapped Goblin Welder and infinite treasures with Sculpting Steel in the bin. In most cases. So from this point, you win the game by using Apple's secondary ability in combination with Goblin Welder. So you're going to use 2 of your infinite treasures to sacrifice this in order to have target opponent lose 3 life. From this point, you're going to tap Welder to generate a treasure, targeting treasure and Apple. Then you're going to do it again. Sacrifice, use Welder, ETBs again, untaps Welder, sacrifice, you get the idea, right? So this is the most simple way to win with this combo, but obviously there are other routes that you can do. If for whatever reason your Apple is not able to use its ability because you are under Nullrod or something. Because Grafdigger's Cage shuts off the ability for creatures to enter the battlefield from libraries, which shuts down Magda's activation for getting creatures, but it additionally also shuts down things like Sisay, Winota, and Kinnan, among other things, like the 2-field tutors that you would normally get in green. But in addition to this, it's also a silver bullet to things like Underworld Breach lines. So having lines that win through these sort of board states where you don't need to remove your own Grafdigger's Cage to let your opponents win or attempt to win is a boon to have for your deck. Now, because we can't actually go and grab anything that is a creature, we can go and get Liquid Metal Torque or Mirror the Forebears. So if you start with, say, 10 treasure tokens, you can either ETB Liquid Metal Torque, tap it to make Magda a artifact, or you can go and grab Mirror the Forebears, name Dwarf, pay 1, and have this become a copy of Magda that's an artifact, which will legend rule Magda back to the command zone. So from this point, you'll use the other 5 treasures to go and get Clock of Omens. You'll then do your Clock of Omens combo, generating you infinite tapped treasures, leaving you with 1 untapped treasure and an artifact version of Magda on the battlefield at the end. So from this board state of a Mirror of the Forebears copy of Magda being an artifact, plus our untapped treasure token, infinite tapped treasure tokens, we'll then go and get a vehicle. Tap Magda, crew a vehicle. Add a treasure, going to 2. Use our tapped treasures to use Magda's ability to get Apple, untapping Magda. Tap Magda and Apple for Clock of Omens, targeting Magda, generating a treasure, untapping Magda. Crew your vehicle, go to 4. Use our tapped treasures, grab Sculpting Steel, ETB as a copy of Erech's Tempting Apple. This will go to the bin for Legend Rule, ETB untarget or untap Magda. Use the copy of Apple and Magda for Clock of Omens, generating a treasure, untapping Magda, and then crew again, going up to 6. From this point, you'll use your tapped treasures to go and grab Lotus Petal and Elixir of Immortality. So if you are not on Elixir of Immortality in your deck list, then you can't do this combo. So at this point, we're going to sack Lotus Petal to add a red mana. This will go to the grave. Then we're going to use the 1 mana and 1 treasure to activate Elixir of Immortality, shuffling Elixir, Lotus Petal, and Apple back into the library. We're then going to use our tapped treasures here to get all 3 of these back. Legend Rule Sculpting Steel goes to the bin. Apple will ETB, so will these. Untap Magda. Apple Magda, treasure. Untapping Magda, tap Magda to crew, treasure. Sacrifice Lotus Petal, go up 1, use 1 treasure, use the mana, Elixir of Immortality, Lotus Petal, and Sculpting Steel this time will go to your library. You'll then continue this loop in each loop that you do of this, with Sculpting Steel ETBing as Apple, or Apple coming in replacing Sculpting Steel. You'll continue to use Clock of Omens to tap Magda and then crew, and then repeat the process over and over again, netting 1 treasure every loop. So from this point, you can use Elixir of Immortality and Apple, after you have successfully made infinite treasures, to use 2 mana to sacrifice this and deal 3 damage to a player, and then Elixir of Immortality and Apple will go back to your library when you use Elixir of Immortality's ability. And then you'll repeat the process, draining the table. All of these lines are going to assume that Goblin Welder is a dwarf based on Maskwood Nexus, and then also an artifact based on Liquimetal Torque, or Mirror the Forebears, or any other way that you can make this into an artifact. This is going to be a loop using Clock of Omens and an artifact dwarf version of Goblin Welder. So Liquimetal Torque is going to make this into a artifact. But the problem is that in order to tap Welder, you need to put its ability on the stack, right? So in order to do this, you need something in grave and something on the field. So in this case, we're going to use a mana crypt that had been removed earlier in the game. So you'll tap your Goblin Welder to Liquimetal Torque for your mana crypt. This is going to put a Magda trigger on the stack. This is going to resolve, and then mana crypt is going to ETB. From this point, you're going to use the treasure and mana crypt to untap your Welder, retap your Welder, putting a Magda trigger on the stack. This will resolve, and then Liquimetal Torque will enter. Mana crypt will go back, and then you'll use Liquimetal Torque with the new treasure to untap Welder, and then you'll weld out Mana Crypt for Liquimetal Torque, making another treasure, and then you'll continue the process. This will make you infinite tapped treasures, and then you can go for any of the Goblin loop or Goblin Welder loops that will make untapped treasures using Ariet's Tempted Apple, etc., in order to win the game. And this is also one of the reasons why Grafdigger's Cage is out in this example, is because this sort of thing can still win through Grafdigger's Cage. So there's not always going to be situations where you have access to an artifact in your graveyard. So in order to compensate for this, we have multiple things in our deck that have other usages. Obviously, Jeweled Lotus for our commander, Lotus Petal for a bunch of different things, Apple for combo routes, as well as just being a good value piece, and Unlicensed Hearst. So for Unlicensed Hearst, when you crew it, because you haven't used its ability yet, it'll be a 0/0. So you crew it with Magda, and then this will go to the graveyard. So to start the loop, you will do something like activate Mirror the Forebears, becoming a copy of Goblin Welder, and then from this point, you would go and use Magda's ability to grab a artifact that can go to the graveyard. In this case, we're going to use Unlicensed Hearst. We're going to crew it with Magda. It's going to go to the graveyard. At this point, we're going to use our artifact dwarf Mirror the Forebears Goblin Welder to swap out another artifact on field, which is, in this case, Grafdigger's Cage. You cannot use Clock of Omens, so there must be another artifact on field. And that will allow you to bring back your Hearst and put Cage in the bin. From this point, you use your Hearst and your treasure token that you make to untap your Welder, and then you weld back in Grafdigger's Cage, putting this away, making an extra treasure token that comes in untapped, and then you repeat the process over and over and over again to make infinite tapped treasures. And if you are using this particular loop, you can end it with Grafdigger's Cage in the bin, and then you can go and grab your Zoran because you already have your Maskwood Nexus, or you can go and grab your Wandering Throne or whatever in order to generate infinite untapped treasures. Or you can go through any loop that ends with Iriad's Tempting Apple, and using Welder to make the infinite treasures as well. We've gone over a couple of those. And yeah, it's pretty simple route. Just the only difference is that you have to start by either having something on field or tutoring for something that you can put in the graveyard from the actual field, as well as another artifact on field if you're specifically using Mirror the Forebears. If you're using Liquid Metal Torque, then that is not required. Sacrifice lines are complicated. Once you've used Clock of Omens and Artifact Dwarf to make infinite tap treasures, you're then going to pick 3 different sets of things that you can use to temporarily be on the battlefield in order to allow you to use Elixir of Immortality to shuffle them in after they've gone to the graveyard. This includes Spine of Isha, Lotus Petal, Mox Opal plus Sculpting Steel, or Mox Amber plus Sculpting Steel due to the legend rule, or Dwarven Scorcher in combination with Unlicensed Hearst and Maskwood Nexus so that you can actually get Scorcher from your library. This can be done with Bogardan Hellkite, which is the one that is in Ira's guide, but I think that because most decks are no longer on that, I would go through the Maskwood Nexus line instead. The first loop that we're going to look at is Spine of Isha, Lotus Petal, Mox Opal plus Sculpting Steel, or Mox Amber plus Sculpting Steel in combination with Elixir. Spine of Isha reads, when Spine of Isha enters the battlefield, destroy target permanent. There is a period here, and then it says, when Spine of Isha is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return it to its owner's hand. So because it says when instead of instead, you can respond to this ability. So what you're going to do is, after you have your infinite tapped treasures, you're going to get your Lotus Petal, you're going to get your Mox Opal, and then you're going to grab Spine of Isha, targeting itself. In response to its ETB trigger, you're going to tap it and your Artifact Dwarf to generate a treasure, untapping your Artifact Dwarf. You're going to let the first part finish. This will go to the graveyard. In response to the second part, you're going to hold priority. You're going to sacrifice Lotus Petal, put it into the graveyard, adding 1 mana. You're going to tap Mox Opal and the Artifact Dwarf to generate another treasure, untapping the Artifact Dwarf, using 1 treasure. You're going to grab Sculpting Steel, ETB as a copy of Mox Opal. You're going to tap your Sculpting Steel, your Artifact Dwarf, to make another treasure, untapping your Artifact Dwarf. Now you're going to use Elixir's ability with the mana that you sacrificed plus this mana that you made from your Lotus Petal. You're going to put Opal, Lotus Petal, and Spine of Isha back into your library, as well as Elixir of Immortality. And then you're going to do the exact same thing. You're going to tutor out Lotus Petal and Mox Opal, ETB Legend Rule for Sculpting Steel. You're going to tap Mox Opal and Adaptive Automaton to make a treasure. You're going to bring out Spine targeting itself in response to the ETB trigger. Tap, tap, make another treasure, untapping your dwarf. This is going to go to the graveyard in response to the secondary effect. You're going to sacrifice Lotus Petal, making 1 red. And then you're going to use a treasure, going down to 4, to Elixir of Immortality, Lotus Petal, Spine, Sculpting Steel back to your hand. Or not your hand, your deck. You're going to use Magda's ability to bring out Lotus Petal, Sculpting Steel, ETB as a copy of Mox Opal, Legend Rule. And then you're going to ETB Spine. Again, you're going to go through the same loop, tapping your Mox Opal, or your Sculpting Steel or whatever, plus your Dwarf to make a treasure, untapping your Dwarf. ETB Spine, target itself, respond, tap this and the Dwarf, make another treasure. In response to the secondary ability, you let the first part resolve, goes to the bin, and then sacrifice your Lotus Petal, making 1 red, use one of the 2 treasures that you just made, and then you continue this loop each time, putting all of these things back into your deck, ETBing your Mox Opal, which is a legend, which puts your Sculpting Steel back, grabbing these 2 things and Elixir back to field, and then lastly your Spine. So it's a pretty simple loop, and it only works because you can respond to the secondary effect of Spine of Isha. This particular line is very niche. It has less sort of requirements than the Spine Sculpting Steel Opal line, but Spine Sculpting Steel Opal wins through Grafdigger's Cage, or generates infinite treasures through Grafdigger's Cage, whereas this one does not, because you need to grab a creature. So this also only is worth doing if you don't have access to Battered Golem or Goblin Welder plus a way to give it haste, etc. But having a backup to a backup to a backup is never a bad thing. So it functions pretty simply. Unlicensed Hearst, if you don't use its ability, becomes a 0/0 when crewed, which will state-based action put it into the bin. Maskwood Nexus allows you to go and grab your Dwarven Scorcher because it becomes a dragon. Dwarven Scorcher reads, sacrifice Dwarven Scorcher. It deals 1 damage to target creature. You can target itself, unless that creature's controller has Dwarven Scorcher deal 2 damage to him or her instead. So the way that this works is that you start by getting all of your pieces. You then tap Unlicensed Hearst and your Artifact Dwarf to generate a treasure, untapping your Artifact Dwarf. From here, you will crew with your Dwarf, generating another treasure. Unlicensed Hearst will go to the bin. You'll use Dwarven Scorcher's ability to kill itself and put it to the bin. You'll then sacrifice Lotus Petal for 1 red, and then you will use 1 red and one of the 2 treasures that you generated, going down to 2, to use Elixir of Immortality, putting Elixir, Petal, Scorcher, Hearst back to your library. You'll then replay all of these. You'll then continue the loop, doing Unlicensed Hearst with Adaptive Automaton to clock, generating a treasure. Crewing, generating a treasure. State-based action, sacrifice to itself, sacrifice Lotus Petal, generate the 1, use one of the 2 treasures that you made, and then use Elixir of Immortality, putting all of these back to your library again, and getting them back out with Magda. So the line is very simplified, and it's efficient, but it doesn't win through Grafdigger's Cage. So while you can do this with your mana rocks, which makes it, I guess, quote-unquote, simple to understand, with Mox Opal or Lotus Petal, Mox Opal or Amber in combination with Sculpting Steel, you can also just do it with Spine of Isha. So you go and get all of this stuff to the field, and this will be the last thing that you get. You will hold priority on the ETB, you'll tap it, tap your dwarf, generate a treasure. Untapping your dwarf, because of Clock of Omens. At this point, you're going to tap Unlicensed Hearst and your dwarf, generate a treasure, untapping your dwarf. You're going to crew, generating a treasure. And then this is going to die to state-based action. You will sacrifice Dwarven Scorcher, killing itself. You will let the first portion of Spine of Isha resolve, putting it to the graveyard, holding priority on the second portion of the ability. You will use 2 of the 3 treasures that you generated in order to pay for Elixir of Immortality. This will shuffle Elixir, Spine, the Dwarf, and Unlicensed Hearst back to your deck, and you'll get them back out, making sure that Spine is the last one that you grab. And then you'll continue this loop. You'll make 3 treasures on each loop, using 2 of them for Elixir of Immortality, so we'll go through it one more time. ETB targeting itself for Spine. Tap it, tap your Dwarf, make a treasure. Untapping your Dwarf. Tap Unlicensed Hearst and the Dwarf, untapping the Dwarf, making a treasure. Crew the Unlicensed Hearst, making a treasure. Hearst goes to the bin, sacrifice your Dwarven Scorcher to kill itself. Let the first part of Spine of Isha resolve, hold priority on the second part, use 2 of the 3 treasures that you generated, use Elixir of Immortality, put all 4 back in your library, use Magda to get them back out, with Spine being the last one again, and continue the process, netting 1 untapped treasure in each repetition. Comboing off your Grafdigger's Cage is pretty important, because this does currently shut off a decent amount of decks in the current metagame. That being said, this is sort of the bottom of the barrel as far as how deep you might want to go to do so, and it also requires that you will have already comboed off with an Artifact Dwarf on field. It's a little bit much to ask for in some situations when our decks are not running as many of them as they were in the past, but that's neither here nor there. From this particular point, you're going to want to ETB from Magda's ability, Elixir, Lotus Petal, Mirror the Forebears. Sack Lotus Petal, adding 1 red. You're going to use this to become an artifact copy of Magda, Legend ruling Magda's now dead. You will then use the artifact copy of Magda and Universal Automaton, targeting it with Clock of Omens, untapping it, and making 2 treasures. From this point, you're going to use the tapped treasures in Magda's ability to go get Cursed Mirror, entering as a copy of the artifact Magda, Legend rule, back to the bin. You're then going to do the same thing, untapping this, and generating 2 more treasures. You're going to go down 2 treasures, use Elixir of Immortality, putting all 3 of these back. You're going to ETB all of them again with Magda's abilities, and then you're going to use Lotus Petal for the 1, which I didn't remove it before, my bad. You're going to use the 1 from Mirror the Forebears to become a copy of this. This is going to leave. You're going to tap this for Clock again, untapping this, making 2 more treasures. You're then going to use 2 treasures, and then you're going to use Elixir of Immortality, putting these back and having them come back in. This will come back in as a copy of this. This will Legend rule. Now you will use Lotus Petal in order to generate a red. You'll then use these two, untapping this, making 2 treasures. You'll then use the floating red and one of your treasures in order to use Elixir of Immortality, use Magda's ability to get all 3 of these back to the field, name Dwarf, replace this with the mana that you will get from the Lotus Petal in this iteration, and then continue off, making another 2 treasures, untapping this, using those 2 treasures, Elixir, again, copy of this. You then use your Lotus Petal again, make 1 red, tap, tap, untap, generate 2 treasures. You'll use the 1 floating, and then 1 of the counters to Elixir again. And then you'll continue the process going between spending the mana to use Mirror the Forebears, and then keeping the mana around because you can use it for Elixir every time that you play Cursed Mirror, as this will ETB without any cost. So you will net 1 treasure, or 1 untapped treasure, every 2 repetitions of the loop. Making extra treasures is very important, and there's going to be a lot of times where you're going to go and grab something like Roaming Throne in order to get extra treasures. And if you have Maskwood Nexus out, you could grab Zorn or a Dockside, as an example. So there's going to be situations where Dockside will make more than 5, in which case using Cursed Mirror on Dockside can net you extra treasures if you need to play something from hand, while also using treasures to go get something else. Or if there's a lot more than 5, you can just potentially win the game, right? Where if this is 8, well, you're netting an extra 6, which would win you the game with the 2 activations, right? Zorn is a replacement effect, so for every trigger that you get from Magda, it will make 2 treasures. Roaming Throne is a doubling of triggers. So while you'll still make 2 treasures, it's 2 individual triggers of Magda's ability. So if you were to have Zorn and a Roaming Throne out, Magda will trigger twice, and it will make 2 treasures each time, so 4. If you were to make a copy of Roaming Throne, you would then have 3 instances of 2, which is 6. If you were to make a copy of Zorn, you would have 3 instances of 3, which is 9. If you were to put this here instead, you would have 4 instances of 2, which is 8. So having Cursed Mirror come in as Zorn is going to be better in this particular situation. But you can also have Mirror the Forebears come in as a copy of potentially Zorn or Roaming Throne, and in some situations you can use the Mycosynth Gardens to become a copy of Roaming Throne or Artifact Zorn if you are using Mirror the Forebears or Liquid Metal Torque. Another important interaction is that you can make Dockside into an artifact with Liquid Metal Torque, or you can Mirror the Forebears if you have your own Dockside, and then make a copy that you can Sculpting Steel into. So if you've already used your Cursed Mirror or something, there are still technically ways to make copies, but it is rather intensive, unless you've already used Mirror the Forebears on Goblin for whatever reason. Another important aspect about Roaming Throne is that because Maskwood Nexus would make everything into a dwarf, stuff like Dockside's ETB would double. So there are going to be situations where you do have Maskwood Nexus. You can Roaming Throne, make just enough treasures for one more thing, and you might not want to go for clock, or you can't go for clock based on a Nullrod being out. So you can go and grab Dockside, which will double ETB, and then you can win the game from there. I've already shown how you can make infinite treasures through specific Stax pieces, so we're going to talk about how you can remove them, and what is the most efficient way depending on what your deck has. The most common situation is going to be for decks that are running Spine of Isha to just use that, because this is a catch-all that deals with enchantments, lands, artifacts, whatever. So if something is hindering you from winning the game, you can deal with it. The one problem is there are going to be ways for your opponents to flicker their stuff, such as Displacer Kitten or whatever. So there may be situations where you need to Sculpting Steel as a copy of Spine to deal with the problem as well. And if that doesn't work, then potentially you might have to use lines to draw your deck, which is going to be the way that you will have to do it in most situations if you are not on Spine. For this next particular line, it requires you to have Nullrod on the field, and then any artifact in the grave. You'll use your treasures to go grab Goblin Welder, and then either Cursed Mirror or Erech's Tempting Apple, so that you can give Welder haste. Once it has haste, you can tap him to target the Nullrod, and whatever is in the bin, in this case Sculpting Steel, to remove Nullrod from play, which will allow you to win with a Welder combo with Erech's Tempting Apple, which we'll go over shortly. In order to get to an answer for the Grafdigger's Cage, the Blind Obedience, or the Nullrod, you need to be able to draw your deck, and you need to know how you can draw your deck based on what you're actually fighting through. So decks that are not on Elixir of Immortality might not be able to actually generate infinite card draw through Grafdigger's Cage, right? But in most situations, or in all situations, you're not going to be able to do it through Nullrod unless you go a creature route, which means that Grafdigger's Cage can't be in play. So the variance does exist based on what is trying to actually stop you from winning. So the first line that we're going to talk about is the one that wins through Grafdigger's Cage. So at this point, you're going to be using the One Ring, and you're going to be using Elixir of Immortality in combination with Sculpting Steel. So you're going to, after you make infinite untapped treasures, tutor for the One Ring, and then you're going to tap it to draw a card, putting a burden counter on it. At this point, you're going to tutor for Sculpting Steel, and it's going to ETB as a copy of the One Ring, legend ruling it to the graveyard. You're going to tap this to draw a card and put a burden counter on it. Once that happens, you're going to tutor out Elixir of Immortality, and then you're going to shuffle in the One Ring and Elixir of Immortality back to your deck. Then you're going to shuffle both, or use Magda's ability to put them both onto the battlefield again. When the One Ring enters, Sculpting Steel will leave the battlefield because of the legend rule. You'll tap the One Ring to draw a card, and at this point you will draw your deck until you can play something that will allow you to get rid of the artifact, and then you can win the game. This basically means that this is looking to win the game without Erech's Tempting Apple, because Apple does win through Grafdigger's Cage. Situation number 2 is what you can do to draw your deck through something like Blind Obedience. So once you have infinite untapped treasures, you can go and grab Liquid Metal Torque and Goblin Welder, as well as Clock of Omens. You can ETB the One Ring, and then you can grab any other artifact that will allow it to put itself into the graveyard, such as Lotus Petal. From this point, you will put Lotus Petal into the grave by activating it. You will tap the One Ring to draw a card. you will make Goblin Welder into an actual artifact, and then you'll tap Welder in order to either untap the One Ring or to take Lotus Petal and put One Ring into the bin. Then you'll use 2 of your untapped treasures via Clock of Omens to untap your Goblin Welder. And then you'll continue the process, tapping Welder to put Lotus Petal or whatever it is into the graveyard, grabbing out the One Ring, tapping it to draw a card, and then you will continue from here. So, Blind Obedience with Clock of Omens, you can still technically win with Erech's Tempting Apple because you can untap it. This one is pretty simple, and it actually is represented by the board state pretty much, to win through Nullrod or Blind Obedience, or to get rid of them without Spine of Isha. So you have infinite untapped treasures, or even infinite tapped treasures, and then you can use Professional Facebreaker, which you can grab from your library because of Maskwood Nexus making it a dragon, to use its ability to sacrifice a treasure, exile the top card of your library, and you may play that card this turn. Because you have infinite untapped treasures, you can go and grab all of your artifacts that can protect your win, and basically play all the cards in your deck. You have multiple shatter effects, so you can get rid of Nullrod. You can also use other things if necessary to get rid of Blind Obedience, which is not usually required, because winning through Blind Obedience usually requires making infinite treasures with Battered Golem into something like a Clock of Omens or whatever. But you have to get rid of Nullrod before you can go for the untapped treasure variant with the Clock of Omens, so Professional Facebreaker unlocks that by allowing you to draw your deck and play the Shatter to get rid of your Nullrod or get rid of an opponent's Nullrod. This particular line works through Grafdigger's Cage, but it does not work through a Blind Obedience-ish effects or Nullrod. That being said, it's more of a budget list variant of this particular line because having Commander Sphere in CEDH is not super common. Stone of Erech is also not super common either, but it does stop aristocrat effects, and it's like a pseudo way to stop Dockside loops from Underworld Breach and stuff, or shut down Tyam, or a couple other things that need to have creatures in their graveyard. And Soul Guide Lantern will also let you exile each opponent's graveyard, right, if you so desire. So there are some upsides to these. Once you have infinite untapped treasures, which I'm not going to go through the process of getting, you will tap this, pay 2, sacrifice it, and then put it in the graveyard. This is a token, so I can't. And then you will draw a card. And then you will use Elixir's Immortality to put this and Elixir back in your deck. You'll use Magda to take them both back out. And then continue the process until you've drawn your deck, and then you can win with your Lightning Bolt combo or your Twinshot Sniper combo or whatever it is that you want to win with. Not all decks are on Elixir of Immortality, but it is the simplest variant to win with. You'll tutor both Apple and Elixir. You will pay 2 and sacrifice Apple to put it to the graveyard, draining 1 player for 3 life. And then you will use Elixir of Immortality's ability in order to shuffle this and Apple back into your library, and then you will use Magda's activations to pull them both back out, continuing the loop, just draining the table. This line works through Grafdigger's Cage, and it also works through Blind Obedience, but for Blind Obedience you specifically need to go and grab a Clock of Omens. This way, when your Apple and your Elixir of Immortality enter tapped, you can use your infinite untapped treasures to untap the apple and untap the Elixir of Immortality, giving you access to actually using their abilities. So to go through one rep of this, you'll ETB both of them tapped. You'll use 2 treasures to untap apple. You'll use 2 treasures to untap Elixir of Immortality. You'll spend 2 treasures to put apple to the bin, draining an opponent for 3. You'll then spend 2 to put Elixir of Immortality and Iriad's Tempting Apple back into your deck. Because you have Clock of Omens and infinite tap treasures, you can protect your Elixir of Immortality as much as necessary through any amount of removal attempt. At this point, you will now be able to drain the table by completing the loop again and again, untapping both of these with your untapped treasures, paying their costs, putting apple in the grave, using Elixir to put them both back in your deck, getting them back out with Magda, and then just repeating the process. This particular combo is very easy, and it gets through Blind Obedience, Grafdigger's Cage, and Torpor Orb. In order to get through Blind Obedience, you also need access to Clock of Omens in order to untap your apple to use its ability. So for this, you will go and grab your Welder if it's not already on the field. If it is on the field, you just go and grab apple. Either way, apple is your second target. After apple ETBs, you pay 2 mana with your infinite treasures to sacrifice it and deal 3 damage to an opponent. At this point, you'll use Welder, targeting apple and one of your treasures to bring back apple. Apple will ETB, untapping Welder. You'll then use 2 more of your infinite treasures to put apple back to grave, dealing 3 damage to an opponent, and then using Welder to swap it for a treasure. Now, if Grafdigger's Cage and Torpor Orb are out, this is no problem. This is not a creature ETB, it's a sacrifice ability, etc., right? But if Blind Obedience is out, then this will enter tapped. So if you have infinite untapped treasures, you'll go grab Clock of Omens, and then when this ETB's tap, you'll use 2 of the untapped treasures to use Clock of Omens ability, untapping your apple, letting you use 2 more of your untapped treasures to sacrifice it, put it to grave, and then do your Welder loop. This will ETB as tapped again because of Blind Obedience. You'll use 2 more of your treasures for the Clock of Omens activation ability, targeting Iriad's Tempting Apple, untap it, etc. When this ETBs, regardless if it's tapped or not, it will also untap your Welder, which will allow you to continually do the combo over and over and over again. So this particular line is very constrained by what it can win through. Twinshot Sniper is a creature, so it does not allow you to take it out of the graveyard or from your library because of Grafdigger's Cage. It has an ETB effect, which Torpor Orb shuts down. And Nullrod is something that will shut down Clock of Omens. And in order to do this particular loop, you need to have Welder be an artifact. So, assuming you have infinite untapped treasures, you will then go and grab your Liquid Metal Torque or your Mirror of the Forebears. Before you do this, you will grab Cursed Mirror or Apple, give him haste. After he has haste, you make him into an artifact. Once he is an artifact, you can go and grab any artifact in your deck that will sacrifice itself, such as a Lotus Petal or a Jeweled Lotus. You will sacrifice it, put it to the grave. You will then target Welder using Twinshot Sniper and Jeweled Lotus in this example. You will untap Welder with 2 of the infinite untapped treasures via Clock of Omens ability. And then you will weld in Twinshot Sniper, taking out Jeweled Lotus. From this point, you will ETB your 2 damage to any target, and then you will continue the process using Clock of Omens, using 2 treasures to untap Welder. You'll retap Welder, welding out Twinshot for whatever's in your graveyard, and then you will continue the process over and over and over again until Twinshot has ETB'd enough times with Welder's ability to kill the table. This particular line is a little bit outdated, however, it does start in an interesting way, so I want to point it out. Assuming that you've made infinite tap treasures with a universal automaton, you can win with the Twinshot sniper loop without needing other things. So if you don't have access to any other artifacts that can go to the graveyard, like Apple or Lotus Petal, Jeweled Lotus, any Mox Opal that can get put into the graveyard from making a copy of it with Sculpting Steel, there's a lot of things that you can't have access to make this be a requirement. But it's neither here nor there. Assuming that we don't have the things that we need, you'll then make Welder into a artifact. If you don't already, take Maskwood Nexus out of your library with Magda. Grab Cursed Mirror coming in as a copy of Goblin Welder, so it will now be an artifact Welder with haste. At this point, you're going to have Universal Automaton available. So you will ETB Twinshot Sniper targeting Universal Automaton with the ETB ability. In response to the ability, you're going to tap Twinshot Sniper and the Automaton to generate a treasure. Automaton will take the damage and go to the bin. You'll then use Welder to bring back Automaton and remove Twinshot Sniper. Because of Maskwood Nexus, this will also generate a treasure. So now you'll use your Automaton and one of the treasures that you just used. So you would make it tapped to untap your Welder, and then you're going to do the same thing where you're going to ETB Twinshot Sniper, and then you're going to shoot an opponent this time. This will generate a treasure from the activation of Welder, and then you're going to do the exact same thing. Twinshot Sniper, tap one of your treasures, and then untap your Welder, and then repeat the process with your Universal Automaton over and over and over again until you have killed the table. This particular combo works whether or not you have Maskwood Nexus in play. It does not work if you have Nullrod, Torpor Orb, or Grafdigger's Cage, as Twinshot Sniper is part of this. So ETBs are shut down by Torpor Orb. The Welder ability is shut down for creatures via the Grafdigger's Cage, and Nullrod will not work if you are using Soul Cauldron to give Welder's ability to Battered Golem because, well, he's an artifact. So to start the loop, you will need to grab your Twinshot Sniper, your Cauldron, Scorcher, Welder, and Jeweled Lotus, or anything that can sacrifice itself to go to the graveyard. You'll put your Jeweled Lotus in the graveyard. In this case, I'm just going to put it in exile for now because I need to put these in graveyard. Sacrifice Dwarven Scorcher to kill your Welder. At this point, you're going to use Agatha's Soul Cauldron to exile Welder under it and give a counter to Battered Golem. Once Battered Golem has a counter, it will then gain access to Welder's ability. You'll tap Battered Golem for Welder's ability, targeting Twinshot Sniper and, in this case, Jeweled Lotus. Jeweled Lotus will ETB untapping your Battered Golem, and then you will continue swapping out Jeweled Lotus for Twinshot Sniper, and then you will ETB deal 2 damage to an opponent. This will untap Battered Golem, the ETB part, and you will continue just swapping these two over and over again. Maskwood Nexus is most likely going to be used in a way to make your infinite treasures, but if for some reason you have infinite treasures and Maskwood Nexus isn't in play, this will also work because these will ETB, they are artifacts, and they will untap Battered Golem. It's very unlikely for this to ever be a situation though, because Clock of Omens would need to be removed, and if you don't have access to Battered Golem, you will need to be using a line from a combination of Apple and something else, and if you have access to Apple, Twinshot Sniper is usually not going to be the best choice. This particular combo works through Blind Obedience, and it works through Torpor Orb. It does not work through Grafdigger's Cage unless you already have Axgard Cavalry on the battlefield. So it functions pretty similarly to a Welder loop, where you're trying to abuse the fact that Axgard Cavalry has an ability, so you're going to need to have it be an artifact. So Liquid Metal Torque or Mirror of the Forebears is going to be required, and then if you're taking it out of your deck, then you're going to need something like Cursed Mirror or Apple in order to give it haste. Once it is an artifact, you're then going to use 3 of your treasures that you have available to you to tap Maskwood Nexus. This is going to ETB a Changeling, or a Shapeshifter, I should say. The Shapeshifter, if under Blind Obedience, will enter tapped, in which case you will need to use 2 treasures to untap your Liquid Metal Torque in order to tap this to make your new Shapeshifter into an artifact so that you can use Clock of Omens to untap it. However, if Blind Obedience isn't, then this isn't something you need to worry about. These will ETB untapped. So at this point, you're going to use the infinite untapped treasures in Clock of Omens to untap Maskwood Nexus. You're then going to tap Axgard Cavalry to give the Shapeshifter that you've made haste. Because this is an artifact, you'll then use Clock of Omens to untap it. Then you'll continue the process, making infinite copies of a 2/2 Shapeshifter, giving it haste, and then untapping both the Axgard Cavalry and the Maskwood Nexus with your treasures via the Clock of Omens activated ability. So then once you have infinite 2/2 Shapeshifters, in this case they will be 3/2 Dwarves, then you can just swing out at your opponent and win through combat damage. This particular loop works through Grafdigger's Cage, Torpor Orb, and Blind Obedience given specific board states, and Nullrod it definitely doesn't work through. And the reason for this is because you need access to Elixir of Immortality. So to start the loop, you're going to do your draw loop. You're going to either use the One Ring, Sculpting Steel, as a copy so that you can use this with Elixir of Immortality to draw your deck, or you're going to need to use Professional Facebreaker's ability to draw your deck. At this point, you're going to play either Lightning Bolt or Channel Twinshot Sniper. Once this is done, it'll go to the graveyard. You can then use Elixir of Immortality to shuffle these three things back into your deck, or whatever this is plus Elixir of Immortality, so two things. And at that point, you can tutor back out your Elixir of Immortality, do your draw loop in order to get the spell or the channel ability, or both, and then use your untapped treasures in order to use the ability or Lightning Bolt and continue the process, doing your draw loop to get the thing back out, and then pew-pewing down the table. If Blind Obedience is out, then you need to use Clock of Omens' ability with your infinite untapped treasures to untap Elixir of Immortality every time that it needs to be used, but that is the only thing that can really hamper this from working. Grafdigger's Cage shuts off you grabbing Professional Facebreaker. It also shuts off you grabbing Twinshot Sniper, but because this is a draw loop, that doesn't matter. This particular combo ender works through Torpor Orb and Blind Obedience given the correct board state for Blind Obedience, which this is not. It does not work through Nullrod and does not work through Grafdigger's Cage. The reason for this is because you need to crack your treasures, and you also need to go and grab a creature. So once you have your infinite treasures, you're going to go grab Realm-Scorcher Hellkite in 99% of lists, and if you are on a hyper budget list and need like a 20-cent card, then you're going to be grabbing Skarrgan Hellkite. At this point, you're going to sacrifice a bunch of your treasures, and then you're going to activate either Realm-Scorcher Hellkite or Skarrgan Hellkite. You're going to hold priority between each activation so that your opponents, if they do have something that has split second and can destroy a creature or something, can't respond and then not have the triggers resolve. So that way you still kill the table with the burn damage from your creatures, regardless of if the opponent can actually do anything to interact, because you are able to hold priority between each activation. Reckless Fireweaver has some suspect card quality. Some turbo lists do still run this, as its effect is relatively potent as far as ending games. You can tutor this out to the field if you have Maskwood Nexus on play, or you can just play it from hand. If you play it from hand, as a value piece, it sort of gives you extra negative attention, which is not ideal since you're already going to be a threat pretty much no matter what, since you do have a tutor in the command zone. Because you can win off of Clock of Omens with tapped treasures, it makes it so that any board state where Clock of Omens can win the game is just bad news bears for your opponents, and they should continually kill Magda to prevent that. That being said, it does win through Nullrod, Blind Obedience, and Torpor Orb, just not with the Clock of Omens combo, at least for Nullrod and Blind Obedience. Torpor Orb doesn't stop this because it is whenever an artifact enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage, so it's not an effect from a creature entering the battlefield, it's an effect from an artifact entering the battlefield. And for the actual Magic Judge ruling on this, if you look at something like Confusion in the Ranks, whenever an artifact, creature, or enchantment comes into play, its controller chooses a target permanent another player controls that shares a type with it, exchange control of those permanents. So for this, it triggers whenever an artifact, creature, or enchantment enters the battlefield. It can still trigger, but will only do so for artifacts and enchantments, not if it's an artifact creature. So that makes it so that this particular combo is relatively potent since it does go through a decent amount of stacks. It just doesn't go through Grafdigger's Cage if you need to actually grab it with your Maskwood Nexus line. But because this is only a shortcut piece, it's not really the best choice. If you'd rather have a shortcut piece that does a little bit more for you, then you would want to have the dragons. While the dragons are a little bit more expensive, obviously, and casting them from hand is not really as simple as casting a Reckless Fireweaver, you get a lot less extra threat because one of those dragons is already out, since they have to worry about the dragon beating their face in, and Reckless Fireweaver is similar, but not the same. The key to this particular combo ender is Maskwood Nexus, making everything a dragon and a dwarf. So the combination of Terror of the Peaks and Dwarven Bloodboiler make it so that it is relatively easy to kill all of your opponents with the creatures that are in your deck. That being said, Torpor Orb shuts this down completely, and getting Terror of the Peaks onto the field without Grafdigger's Cage hindering you is going to be very difficult, so you can't win through Grafdigger's Cage in most situations. You can technically win through Blind Obedience depending on what the HP of the opponent is that is controlling it. And that is because you can technically take some of your creatures, ETB them, kill the person with Blind Obedience, and then go off with Bloodboiler. So the way that this functions is pretty simply. At this point, you're going to Dwarven Bloodboiler, you're going to ETB a creature, which is going to put a Terror of the Peaks trigger on the stack. So on top of that trigger, you're going to tap Dwarven Grunt, as an example, to Dwarven Bloodboiler to give it +2/+2, which gives it a 3/3. Magda makes it a 4/3 technically. So at this point, this Dwarven Grunt can have this ability resolve, and then you can resolve the Terror of the Peaks ETB effect. It'll then see that Dwarven Grunt is a 4/4, and it will take that power and then use it as the damage that it deals. So it is much easier to kill all of your opponents with Dwarven Bloodboiler, especially in situations where you have access to Elixir of Immortality, because with Elixir of Immortality and any dwarf that allows you to sacrifice itself, such as Dwarven Scorcher, means that you can put Dwarven Scorcher in the graveyard, use some of your infinite untapped treasures with Elixir of Immortality to put that back in your deck, and then tutor it back out, and then put another trigger on the stack for Terror of the Peaks, and then continue that way. But if you're not on Elixir of Immortality, it is a very specific amount of damage that you can get based on what creatures you are running in your deck and how many creatures that you are running in your deck. Protecting your clock combo is very important, and if you assume a very limited board state such as Magda, an artifact dwarf, a vehicle that we've used to actually generate our treasures, and then our 5 treasures, your opponent has a lot of places that they can interact. So if we put a Magda activation on the stack and we sacrifice 5 treasures, they can remove Magda, or they can remove our Universal Automaton, and we don't really have a way to deal with this. However, if they do this, we can go and get something else, like a God Pharaoh statue, Damping Sphere, Torpor Orb, Winter Orb, Grafdigger's Cage, whatever is important at the time, right? Or if they let it go through, we get our Clock of Omens and attempt to win. So at this point, we can put our Clock of Omens activation on the stack. As part of the activation cost, a dwarf is tapped, which will put the Magda trigger on top. You then have to ask what your opponent is looking to interact with, if they are interacting, or when. If they're looking to interact with your Universal Automaton getting untapped, then the Magda trigger will happen, and you will generate a treasure. You can then hold priority on top of their interaction, use the treasure and your vehicle to untap your Universal Automaton. And then if you have any other piece of artifact ramp or any other artifact on the field, you can use that plus your Universal Automaton to actually restart the combo. For this next example, we're going to be talking about Clock of Omens being on the stack, and then our Magda trigger is on top of it, but the trigger is what our opponent is going to interact with. So at this point, we're going to assume that we have a Soul Ring, a Mana Crypt, and a Springleaf Drum in play. So with the interaction on top of our Magda trigger, we're then going to tap our vehicle and our Soul Ring in order to untap our Universal Automaton. We can then use our Artifact Dwarf, our Universal Automaton, and our Mana Crypt in order to restart the combo. Now, if our opponents choose to interact a second time with our Magda trigger on the stack, we don't have enough artifacts in order to restart our combo as it took 3 before. Our Clown Car and our Soul Ring to untap our original Artifact Dwarf, and then another artifact to start the combo again. If instead of starting with 5 treasures here, we started with 7 for our first Magda activation, then we would have 2 left over, which would let us tap these again, untap our Artifact Dwarf, and then give us another attempt at starting the combo. Now, at this point, most of the time you're going to succeed. However, there will be situations where if your opponents are communicating properly, that either there will be a third kill spell to get rid of your Magda or your Universal Automaton, or someone will have been sandbagging some interaction that can remove an artifact. It's a lot harder to do so if they're not in green, but it is something that I've had happen, and I'm sure other pilots have had happen as well. But in most situations, having 6 artifacts on field, such as a vehicle, 2 extra treasures, and then 3 other artifacts of whatever type, then you can usually protect your combo. That being said, making them have it is definitely one way of going about it, and I don't blame any pilot that chooses to do that more often than not. For some reason, some players like to try to interact after you've made infinite tap treasures, but they can't. You can just win on top of their interaction no matter how many pieces of interaction that they have. So it's very futile to do so. So you can either activate Magda, hold priority, and then get every creature and every artifact out on the field before you even try to restart, which means that at that point, if they're looking to interact, they have to fight through God Pharaoh Statue, Damping Sphere, potentially Thorn of Amethyst, and Sphere of Resistance, depending on what's in your build. Or they just have to fight through being able to untap with Clock with 30-something artifacts, which means 10 pieces of interaction at the very least. And that's not possible for your opponent to have. So even if they do try to fight, you have access to Cursed Mirror to make a copy. You also have access to Maskwood Nexus plus Battered Golem loop instead, or your Maskwood Nexus, Goblin Welder, Iriot's Tempting Apple, and Sculpting Steel lines. So no matter what they do, from this point, you're making those infinite treasures and winning the game. So trying to interact is futile, and they're honestly quite stupid for trying. Alright, so you're playing against Magda, and Magda has a board state where she has an Artifact Dwarf, 5 treasures, a vehicle, and Magda herself. The first thing that's going to happen is that Magda's activation will go on the stack. You can then choose to interact or not. If you choose to interact, Magda will go get something else. They'll go get something like Portal to Phyrexia, which will wipe the board and allow them to get Magda back the following turn from the graveyard. And if you manage to exile the graveyard, they can just put her back in the command zone, and it doesn't really matter. They can go get the Dockside that they wiped from their opponent instead, which will put them even further ahead. So it's kind of a screwed if you do, screwed if you don't situation if you're reacting to the actual Magda activation, because they can go get their God Pharaoh statue, their Damping Sphere, their Grafdigger's Cage, which can shut down a lot of different ways to win, like breach lines with Grafdigger's Cage or God Pharaoh statue, or Damping Sphere shutting down anything that uses a lot of spells, or any line that uses Gaia's Cradle. So it's almost always best to just let Magda do her thing and deal with the consequences. So in this case, if they're trying to win the game and they go and they get their Clock of Omens, this is where you can look to interact. Once Clock is on the field and they look to activate it in order to untap their Artifact Dwarf, the Magda trigger will then go on the stack. At this point, you can look to interact, and you should always interact with the Magda trigger itself and not the untap. The reason for this is because if you interact with the untap, Magda will generate a treasure, which will give an artifact that can be used to attempt to untap the dwarf beforehand. So as the board state sits right now, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 artifacts, ignoring the ones on the right. So if you're looking to interact here with the Magda trigger, if they tap their Clown Car and their Soul Ring to untap their dwarf, they need to tap their dwarf and another artifact in order to put another trigger on the stack. If there's secondary interaction, there's no way that they can get through it because they only have one artifact remaining. If the Magda is greedy and doesn't have the extra artifacts to untap their dwarf and start to attempt to win again through their clock combo, you have to decide what you want to remove. If it's creature removal, it's either going to be Magda or Universal Automaton. If it's artifact removal, it can be Automaton or any artifact dwarf, or the Clock of Omens. Clock is usually going to be your best hit. And the reason for this is because it's a lot harder to get Clock back to win, and it forces your opponent to use at least 10 treasures in most cases to go and find the pieces that they need to attempt another way to make infinite untapped treasures. Or infinite treasures in general. So, by removing the Clock of Omens, this is a 4 CMC thing. Goblin Engineer can only get 3 or less. Goblin Welder requires you to have Maskwood Nexus in play in order to even tutor for it, and it's a 1 in 99 otherwise. An Elixir of Immortality is a 1 in 99. So even with these two things, it's still 2 in 99 to get something that can get the clock out of the graveyard and back into play. And if you're using Elixir of Immortality, it doesn't put it right back into play, right? It requires that it be put back in the deck, and Magda needs to use treasures again to get it out. The next portion to talk about is what happens if they can't restart the combo and you only have one chance at interaction and it's not the Clock of Omens. Do you remove the Magda, or attempt to, or do you remove the Universal Automaton? In a board state like this, if Magda does have the resources to be recast, you almost definitely want to remove the Universal Automaton or the Artifact Dwarf. Or Magda herself if she's made into an artifact, right? Because, well, if she can be recast and your opponents aren't willing to give you the information that they have a creature counter, then it makes things a little awkward. If they will divulge the information that you can rely on them to stop a win attempt, then the Magda can plan around this and just sort of let the opponents use their resources to stop each other before even recasting her, because they know they have their combo on field. So it's a screwed if you do, screwed if you don't sort of situation. But if you opt to remove the Universal Automaton, it's going to take up to 5 turns in the current board state to go and get another Artifact Dwarf to attempt to win. If they play a Dwarf 2 turns in a row, then it's still going to be a 3-turn clock. So you have more turns to play with and more turns to attempt your own win, if you so desire, by removing the Artifact Dwarf rather than Magda herself. And while it is dangerous to give Magda treasures, it's also sometimes in your benefit to give her treasures to potentially allow her to go get something to stop an opponent's win attempt. It might not always be possible for Magda to go and get something to win, because, well, someone might be like, hey, I have interaction if you go and you attempt to get an Artifact Dwarf, and you insist on doing so? Will you use your activation to go get something to stop a win instead? So a lot of it comes down to table politics and being able to accurately assess threat for every other player, not just the Magda itself, which is a lot harder to do. And because it's a very nuanced situation, there's no correct answer. But like I said, in a board state like this, it's usually going to be the lesser of two evils to remove the artifact dwarf and leave Magda be. Board states like this are where it's a little bit more complicated, because if they somehow manage to get 5 treasures by tapping 4 dwarves or something, you're screwed if you do and you're screwed if you don't, as far as which one is removed unless they don't have the resources to recast Magda, right? And if they do, and you don't get the information that there is a creature counter available, then they just have a 2-turn clock if you remove the Universal Automaton. So Magda and the other 2 will then go and make the treasures necessary. And if Magda is recast, then you have 2 dwarves at least, 3 for Magda herself, for backup artifacts. So including the clown car, it's 1, 2, 3, 4 total artifacts. And if you have any other artifacts in play that are ramp, like Mana Crypt or Soul Ring, then you then have to not only remove a creature the first time, but you need 2 points of interaction on the second attempt, which makes it extremely difficult to do. So in these situations, you sort of have to remove the artifact dwarf and hope that someone gets something in the next 2 turns to stop the Magda's win attempt when they finally get the treasures. But again, the problem is if they get to 5 treasures, they can attempt a win on top of another win, which makes it really difficult to play around. Interacting with the Battered Golem line is simple. Once Battered Golem is tapped, and the Magda trigger is on the stack to make a treasure, remove the Battered Golem. If the treasure doesn't ETB, obviously it can't untap, letting it crew again. So this is the piece that you would interact with, and not Magda. Stopping a combo that uses Goblin Welder in combination with Maskwood Nexus is also very simple. As soon as Welder is used to try to take something out of the bin and replace it with something on the field, like Sculpting Steel for a treasure, or Iriad's Tempting Apple for a Sculpting Steel or whatever, you just react again to the Magda trigger on top of the tap to remove Welder, and then you will shut the line down in its tracks, unless they have access to Elixir of Immortality and enough treasures to get things back to the point where they can continue to combo. Some of you might be wondering about, is there ways to interact with the Rube Goldberg lines or the sacrifice lines? The answer is no, because the Clock of Omens loop will have already happened, and they will have infinite tap treasures, which means they have access to everything else in their deck. So unless you've removed every other way for them to make infinite untapped treasures, like, no, it's just not going to happen.